So I'm going to talk about individuals with recent HIV infection today. And I'm going to tell you about some data from 5 years of a cohort that was done in Southern California. And then I'm going to show you some new data from a new cohort that I have also on recently infected men. And so the new data I'll show you at the end describes a new study I'm doing. We've just finished our first year of data collection. So you're going to see hot off the press, brand new data from our first year, which we're really excited about. And the one thing I'll tell you ahead of time is that the new study I'm doing, we've actually captured a slightly different population than the men that we studied in the previous 5 years, which I'm excited about because they tend to be a lot younger than we expected. So that's something new. So why study people with recent HIV infection? Well, this year, for anyone who went to the CDC 2010 STD Prevention Conference, one of the things that was the big news was that the rate of new HIV diagnoses among MSM, men who have sex with men, was reported to be more than 44 times that of other men and more than 40 times that of women. So these really are, in the United States, a big part of our epidemic. And actually, we're learning in a lot of other countries in the world, as the data is growing, a big part of the HIV epidemic. Now, the range of new HIV diagnoses that the CDC just reported was 522 to 989 cases per 100,000 MSM, and that's compared to 12 per 100,000 of other men and 13 per 100,000 women. And this is based on the 2007 U.S. surveillance data. The high incidence, this suggests that we still have a high incidence of HIV among MSM in the U.S. And in fact, in the 2006 data, we saw that a third of adults that were newly diagnosed were considered to have recent HIV infection. So that was about 56,000 new infections in the U.S. in that year. So there's a lot of people with recent infection in the United States. So why have cohorts with recent infection? Why do we care about this? Well, some of the mathematical models that have been done have suggested that a lot of the HIV transmission occurs during this period of new infection. In fact, some of the estimates are between 25 and 47%. And that's because people at that period of time tend to have a high viral load. They also tend to not yet be on treatment or not yet have controlled virus. And they also sometimes are in a period of time where they're still practicing the risky behaviors. That's how they got HIV. So they were practicing risk, and that's how they acquired infection. And then because they continue to practice risk, that's still how they can transmit infection. So why do cohorts is because at baseline, when we study people with new infection, when we first identify them, we're really looking at the factors that are the risk for acquisition. But as we follow people over time, we then are really looking at the risks for transmission. As I mentioned, as these are people who are highly infectious and also are still probably practicing risky behavior. So follow-up reveals a lot about how secondary transmission occurs, who infects who and why. And this data is really essential for prevention interventions. So I'm going to talk to you about some behavior change that we saw in the ADER cohort, which was the Acute and Early Disease Research Program. That was a NIH-funded multi-site program, of which Southern California was a site, San Diego and Los Angeles. I'm going to show you some work we did with behaviors over time of the Southern Californian men there. Also some look we did at the baseline of people with acquired ARV-resistant virus and behaviors. And then talk about measuring, following up, and recruiting individuals with recent infection and their sexual partners in the new study that I'm doing. And then a specimen repository that we formed and some opportunities for collaboration there. So first, let's start talking about this ADERP cohort. So basically, this was a clinical study. That was when I joined with the team, it had been going already for 5 years, where they were trying to study people with recent infection, and we added on a behavioral component to it. And this is an important thing to understand, is that this was a clinical study that had a behavioral component added, so it wasn't designed initially as a behavioral study. So because of that, as you'll see in this, we had a pretty significant loss to follow-up for the behavioral component because it was an add-on. It wasn't an initial sort of primary aim of the study. Nevertheless, we have people that were followed up to 3.5 years, but most complete data is on those that were involved in the cohort for just 12 months. Everyone in the first year that they were involved was re-interviewed or offered a re-interview every 3 months in the first year, and then after that year, every 6 months after. And we had detailed behavioral data collected by ACASI. And follow-up behavioral data is available on 193 of the men that we enrolled, because not all of the 225 completed follow-up interviews. And these 193 men, over a year of involvement in the study, because I am looking, I took a piece of the data of just those that were involved for a year, reported on 1,011 partners. Per participant, there was about a median of 2 follow-up interviews conducted over a median follow-up time of 106 days, and a total of 562 follow-up interviews. So the first thing we did was look at what happened in the first 3 months, the really early time right around diagnosis. And when we took a look at the first 3 months, at the first interview, the follow-up interview that people were done, one of the first things we saw was that the probability of UAI was much higher for people with a main partner than with any other type of partner. So if I can figure out which is the pointer here. So here's the main partner, and these are the odds ratios and the confidence intervals for any other type of partner. Okay, so people were much more likely to have UAI with a main partner than any other partner. Now, we've seen this before in the literature. People are more intimate with main partners, so they have UAI more with them. Not really a surprise, but this was a pretty big difference. What was interesting here was then if you consider the HIV status of the partners, right? What do we see? Well, we did see a big increase at first 3 months in what we call serosorting, which is that more people had, and this is UAI, with another positive person. Okay? But there, what's interesting is that although there was a decrease in UAI with negative and partners who were unknown, of unknown HIV status, we still had quite a significant amount of UAI happening with these partners. So this was just the first 3 months. So this suggested we are seeing a trend in a drop of risk behavior. We're seeing more serosorting. We're seeing a lot of risk still within main partnerships. So then we decided to look over time at what happened in the rest of the cohort after the 3 months. And one of the things we wanted to look at was just sort of take a general cut of what is the overall pattern of partnering that we see among these men. So one of the things we saw was about 22% of people started and they had a main partner at baseline, but then did not have another main partner or continuing partner throughout the rest of the time. People really divided up across these patterns almost pretty evenly. We had a third of people that had a main partner at baseline and then had a continuing partner at some point during the year. Not necessarily the same, but at least they had some sort of ongoing relationship. Some people had no partner. About another third had no partner, main partner at baseline, and never had a main partner in the entire year. And then we had the smallest percent, about 17%, who did not have a main partner at baseline when they acquired HIV, but then during the year got a main partner, formed a main partnership, and had an ongoing partnership at some point. So we see pretty even split in the patterns over time. People are sort of all over the place. There's not a clear thing that most people tend to form a partner or lose a partner. But what did they do in general in terms of just the number of people they were having sex with? Now remember, because those were sort of persistent partnerships or partnerships that go on. This is just the raw number of partners reported in the 3-month period before any particular interview. And one of the things we do see when you look over a year is a significant drop. So that means over time people are having total numbers of partners that are less. So they go from 8.8 mean partners in the previous 3 months when around the time that they seroconverted to after a year about 5.8 partners. Now that's a pretty impressive drop. However, you could say, you know, that's not exactly a tiny number, you know, 5.8 mean partners after about a year, you know, they're still pretty sexually active there. So we see a trend towards reduction in terms of number of partners, but we still see quite a lot of partners happening. And the biggest drop, and I'll come back to this in a minute, we see is in this first 3-month period. So right around the time that they were diagnosed, initially there's a big drop, and then it sort of stabilizes. It continues down a little bit, but you can see it's pretty much leveling off. How about the types of different partners that they had? Well, from what you saw in terms of persistent partners and having an ongoing partner, we sort of assumed they were main partners. But actually, we asked people at each interview to tell us about the type of partner that they had. And we gave them a list of all these different types. So they could tell us about a main partner, and they all came with definitions. They could have a regular partner, which was somebody that they had sex with on an ongoing basis, but that wasn't necessarily a main partner. A friend, who's somebody that they had social relationships with as well as sex, but that their main relationship was a social one, but they occasionally had sex. They could have an acquaintance partner, who's somebody that they kind of knew, and then they had sex with. A one-time partner, which is somebody they just had sex with once and never again. A trade partner, which is somebody they exchanged drugs or money with for sex, or were given drugs or money for sex. And then an unknown partner, which is somebody they had no name of or no information with. So among these, the main thing that you see here is that this, which is the main partner, was most people reported having a main partner, and the proportion of people with a main partner that was, of the last partners that was a main partner, increased over the year a little bit. In terms of the other types of partners, people pretty much maintained the same pattern they had at the beginning. So about the same portion of people who had had an unknown partner or a trade partner when they acquired HIV had it after 12 months. You know, there's a little bit of a drop, but it was not significant. So this was the biggest change, was the main partnering, and although it's sort of bouncing around, this is a slight significant increase in the percent of those who at the end of 12 months have a main partner. So how about some of the other risk behaviors over the year? So what we did here was we took the 193 men and the 1,011 partners they reported on. And this sort of shows what happened to them over time. So of the 1,011, 597 of them were reported at baseline. And partly that's because we asked them about 3 partners at baseline, and because the interview was becoming too long, on follow-up we only asked people about the last partner, and then if the last partner wasn't a main partner, also a main partner. So we have less partners reported on, partly because of the design of the questionnaire, but also because we do have a drop-off. We started with 193 who reported some partner over time, and we ended up with 55 that we have data on at the end of 12 months. So that was some loss to follow up there. In terms of those who reported any UAI with a partner, there is a slight increase. So at baseline, about 45% reported any UAI, whereas at the end of 12 months, 56% report any UAI. But now that's any UAI with anyone, and that's a pretty gross measure. So we wanted to sort of drill down to this and understand a little bit, does that UAI really mean risk? What's really happening in here? And we were interested in what was really driving the UAI and what was happening with drug use. So interestingly, we do have a slight decrease in those who report having using methamphetamines with partners over time, which is the main drug that was used here. And we have a pretty significant increase down here in those who reported having an HIV-positive partner at all. So that, again, this is pretty good support for a trend towards serosorting. We had about 16% with a positive partner at baseline, and by the end of the year, we have about 36%. Okay, so that's a 20% increase.
Nina, would you explain briefly what serosorting is?
So serosorting is a little controversial because the data about serosorting has been very mixed. Serosorting suggests that people pick a partner of the same status, and it usually refers to HIV-positive people who then choose to have another HIV-positive partner, mostly for the sense of risk reduction and to be able to have unprotected sex without a risk of transmission. So the question has been, do people who are HIV positive select other HIV positive people to be partners? So when they look for partners, do they try to find someone who's also HIV positive? And the evidence is mixed. Some studies have found that with some types of partners, people are looking for positive partners, and others have found that they haven't. So there's a lot sort of to be learned about this so far. Yes?
When you get tested positive for HIV, you have the option to subtype the type of HIV, and then so some MSM who test positive, they go through that and then they get their partner tested. Did you collect data on if they were subtyped and if they knew their subtype or their partner subtype?
So there is data in the ADERP cohort, and as Simon Frost, who's here, is also part of it, knows that the data exists. I didn't have it available for this analysis, so the data is there. There was some effort to recruit some partners and enroll some. I think in total in this cohort about 55 partners were recruited at some point. There was some matching of the partner types. I think they found a lot of diversity, right? That there wasn't.
Mostly subtype B, and you can find closely related viruses that cluster by age, also their ages clustered together, and also by some risk factors. So methamphetamine, so people who were methamphetamine users were infected with more similar viruses than those that were.
Yeah, Simon actually has that data on that and has done that analysis, so he could talk about the subtype. But yeah, so that was generally what they found was it was age. It's interesting, I didn't realize it was age clustering. So it's there, but it wasn't part of this.
Just because the risk of, I mean, when people serosort, the risk of their told is that they can get co-infected with multiple viruses. So
Right, and there was a sub-study actually done in the about sort of super infection as well, and there have been a few cases of super infection identified. I think Davey Smith wrote a paper on that from this cohort, if I remember.
About 5% of these individuals were subsequently infected with another viral strain, which is about the same rate as the incidence of HIV, suggesting that at least during the early parts of infection, there was no protective effect.
So was there a comparison of those, I'm sorry, the people who had unprotected anal intercourse with an HIV positive partner, was it more likely when they had the same subtype?
No, we haven't done that analysis.
That makes sense.
Should just do Q&A at the end.
To do what? Do Q&A at the end? Okay, sorry.
Or keep their questions so that it'll come up in the...
Oh, okay. So that's all right. Okay.
Just define UAI.
Define UAI. Okay, I'm sorry. In case I didn't, UAI is unprotected anal intercourse. Okay. So, but I'd love to have questions, so I'm happy to have them, but I guess we'll hold them for the end. So this is now looking at the trends in unprotected anal intercourse over time by the HIV status of the partner. So this is really where you get a sense of transmission risk and if there is serosorting going on. And so what we've done here, and I have to say this data has been tremendously resilient because we have a number of different ways that we asked about unprotected anal intercourse. We asked about it at last sex, we asked about it ever, we asked about it in the past 3 months. And so this is the most robust measure we have that really looks at the recent UAI. But when we looked at all the other measures, I have to say we saw the exact same pattern. And this is the pattern that we see. The pattern is that they start off about here, the risk drops at some point early in the year and then rebounds. And this rebound is pretty significant. This rebound is with people with the HIV negative or unknown partner. So this is the transmission risk here. Now people with positive partners who are serosorting, who may have a risk of superinfection but no risk of new transmission, actually have UAI at about the same level, which is there's no change over the year that's significant. But the transmission risk here, in terms of really secondary transmission, is increasing. Now there's only one other paper that's really looked at people with new diagnoses or recent infections and followed them over time, and that was some work done in San Francisco by Grant Colfax in a paper published in 2002. And their sample size was a lot smaller, but they actually showed a very similar rebound. And that cohort was followed about 10 years before this one was. So what that suggests is that we're not doing a very good job, and we haven't improved over time in terms of working with people with new diagnoses. Those other guys were also in the period of time where ARVs were really first being introduced, whereas this cohort was in a period of time where it was more established, although the cohort ended in 2007. Still, the fact that we're seeing a same trend in a different era is pretty compelling. So this is pretty much, I think, our, really biggest finding, which is this rebound here that happens and that it really jumps up here after 9 months. Now we did a multivariable analysis, and this is actually not our final model. We're still playing with it because in this one we restricted it to only last partners, and we're using less than our full sample of partners, but we have now reconfigured it and pulled in the new, all the partners, and so we'll be able to redo it in the next couple days. But again, we've redone the sample, this analysis in particular here about 10 different times in 10 different ways, and we always find the same thing, which is, guess what? Meth use really drives UAI. What has bounced around a little bit and right here is close to significance but not there, but I think once we pull in the other partners will come out, is whether the relational factors, which are measured in this study by a partnership assessment scale, which measures dynamics of the partnership and a quantitative measure, so that rather using type of partnership, we use a numeric measure of partnership relation. And that has shown us in previous analyses, and I think is going to come back in here, that the more intimate the partnership, the more likely people are to have UAI. And that's even when you control for HIV status. So I am confident it's going to come back when we put more of our, I think this was a power issue, and I think also our confidence interval will come down. It's because it's bounced around a bit, but always methamphetamine use is the driving factor here. So again, we wanted to look a little bit more about that. And so here we looked at just the raw probability of reporting UAI over time for the methamphetamine users and non-users, and guess what? Boom, the meth users way up. Okay, so also we looked at these relational factors with meth users, and we wanted to know, because we did find an interaction at one point between the status of the partner and the partnership assessment scale. So we said, so do these guys have less intimate partnerships? Well, first of all, here you can see the partnership assessment scale score by types of partners, and you can't read it very well, unfortunately. Something's going on, but this is the unknown partners have the lowest score, and it goes all the way up to over here are the main partners who have the highest mean score. What's interesting is that the trade partners do not have the lowest score, and I think that's because sometimes people know their trade partners pretty well. So partnership assessment scale measures things like how well you know the person, how often you see them, how sort of involved you are in their lives, and so people may be pretty involved in the lives of people they trade sex with. And this actually was a surprise. I expected the trade partnerships to be sort of more anonymous and less involved, but they weren't. We had a smaller number of them, though. So these are our confidence intervals, so it's got a pretty wide one. Now, these are the meth users. This is people who use meth, and this is people who don't use meth. And so you can see our hypothesis was right, that people who use meth have a lower partnership assessment scale overall across all their partnerships than people who don't use meth. So if you're heavily involved in drugs, you're not forming very intimate partnerships. So what are our conclusions over this first year? That these men with recent HIV infection did report decreases in risk behavior and increases in serosorting and main partnering during their first year after diagnosis. That there is evidence in a rebound of risk, however, after 9 months, particularly UAI with uninfected partners or partners of unknown status. And then, as I mentioned, this is very similar to the trend that was reported by Colfax in 2002. So we're seeing a continuation of the same pattern in this population of MSM, and that was also on the West Coast. That was in San Francisco. That meth use clearly remains a driving force in risk behavior. We have seen a lot of evidence of this for the risk of acquisition of HIV. We know that people who use meth are more likely to get HIV, and now we can see even once infected, people who are meth users are continuing to have risk, and so may be an important force in driving the continuation of the epidemic. That there are clearly identified time points for behavioral interventions for people with this period of time of new diagnoses. Those first 3 months, there seems to be a lot going on in terms of a change. People do decrease their behavior. The problem is they're having difficulty sustaining it. And so if we don't get in there after the 3 months, they will rebound. And that future research does need to consider the HIV care status and viral loads when analyzing that. Again, that data exists but is not integrated into this particular data set. In our new study, it is. And what that will suggest is that perhaps some of this is driven by people who had really a controlled virus, and so they felt like they could practice risk without a lot of risk of transmission. That, at this point, we don't know. That's not part of this analysis. So we also did another analysis a couple years ago I want to share with you on the baseline data from here, not looking at trends, but looking at resistant virus and behaviors. At the time that we were doing this study, some of you may remember a number of years ago, a paper came out about a meth user here in the region, New York, who had multiple resistant virus and was said to be methamphetamine user. And there was a lot of concern that there was an association between meth use and resistant virus. So we did an analysis to sort of see what was going on with that. And so we took 117 of our sample that we had complete questionnaires on, and also that we had the serotype had been tested for genotypic and phenotypic HIV drug resistance. So we only had that full data on 117 of the sample. So one of the things we wanted to look at was all the behaviors. Is it the amount of sex? Is it the amount of people you have sex with? And because we had a very detailed questionnaire, we were able to explore a lot of these risks. It was at the, whoops, went the wrong direction. Was it the duration of the sexual activity? We actually knew how long the sex lasted. Was it the existence of a main partner? In other words, repeated sex with the same person. These are some of the things. And then, of course, the type of substance. So overall, when we looked at this subset, we saw that the median number of samples, before I showed you the mean was about 8, the median number in the last 12 months, that's over the year, was 12. A median total of UAI across the last 3 partners was 5, with a mean of 47, and this was the range 0 to 516. So again, this would be the exposure to a partner. 51% of our sample overall reported substance use during sexual activity in the last 12 months, with at least one of their last 3 partners. And 35% reported use with multiple substances. Methamphetamine was our most commonly used drug reported during sexual activity with the last 3 partners. 34% reported meth use. Volatile nitrates was not far behind at 29%, marijuana, and then GHB. 12.5% had a genotypic drug resistance to at least one class of ARVs. This is at baseline when they enrolled. And 14% had phenotypic drug resistance. So then, when we put it in the model, what we see, and the top here is the genotypic resistance, and we see that here it is associated, this is unadjusted and this is adjusted. We see, and these are actually not horrible confidence intervals, a strong association between both meth use and polysubstance use and having genotypic resistance. When we looked at phenotypic resistance, and the difference here was we had a few extra samples in here, so our N was slightly bigger, and I think that's why we had a little more power to see things. We were able to see an association with any substance use, with polysubstance use, with methamphetamine, with ecstasy, and with GHB. Now what's really interesting though is nothing else. So we looked at all these other behaviors. You know, we had these hypotheses. It was the amount of sex, the amount of partner, the duration of sex. Nope, it was just the drug use. So the mechanism for how drug use is really increasing the likelihood of having a resistant virus is not clear, or whether it is sort of more of a network factor. Whether it's that in these networks of drug users, you find more resistant virus. And so people who are using drugs are having sex with other people who are using drugs. That's another hypothesis. Yeah. Oh, I'm not, am I allowed to take a question, or do I?
Just clarify what's genotypic and phenotypic resistance?
It's a different way of measuring what the resistance is. Just repeat the question for the thing. Okay. Okay. So, I mean, it's not that different, though. I mean, it's just the real difference between the sample. Actual genotypic resistance is considered the better measure. We had a slightly bigger sample here, so I think that's why we have a little bit more power to see a difference. So I really wouldn't place a lot of weight in the fact that we have an association with ecstasy here and not here. And again, I think it's not necessarily the type of drug or the drug itself. I think it's the network of drug users that is driving this. I think people have looked for an explanation that's more biological for methamphetamine use, and I don't believe that there really is one necessarily at this point. So the main point, though, was that, and I have to say right now I'm working in a study in Durban in South Africa where we're also looking at people with resistant HIV in people who are recruited into microbicide trial and are HIV positive at the time of enrollment, and we'll be able to look at this in Africa, which is going to be really interesting. So we're about to start enrolling in a study there where we'll also look at some of the behavioral factors, drug use, which hasn't been looked at a lot in South Africa, and resistance. But again, the fact that we did not find any behavioral factors associated with meth use, I thought was pretty interesting. So none of the measures of sexual exposure were associated, and it was just the use of drugs. So now let me tell you about the new cohort. So the new cohort is this new study that we're doing of recently infected men who have sex with men. We call it Metromates. This one is all based in Los Angeles, and since you're here at RDS, we have a slight RDS-like design in that we're trying to recruit partners. We don't go on from the partners, so it's not a you know, a multiple chain study. What we are interested in is recruiting as many sex partners as we can so that we can look at things like types of virus, resistance patterns within them, as well as differences in behaviors. So we are hoping to, over the course of the study, test and enroll 150 men with recent infection. And I'm proud to say in our first year, we're at 35 men. So we're doing really well, and we just started up. So we're going to double our enrollment, or we're supposed to more than double our enrollment in this next year, which I think we will easily do, because we had some downtime. They are enrolled in a cyber cohort and followed for a year. They're given 6 coupons for sex partners, and they're given up to 3 months to refer a sex partner. We hope to follow sex partners that some may have recent HIV, some may have chronic, and some may be HIV negative. And the sex partners, then everyone who's negative that's enrolled is again retested after a year of follow-up. So we have multiple recruitment sites in Los Angeles, but one of the things that we're finding is that it's not so much the number of sites we have, it's the investment in the particular site. So the Los Angeles Gay and Lesbian Center is the largest, well, I think they argue with Fenway over it, but they claim they are the largest health center for gay, lesbians, and bisexual people in the world. It is a very large center, and they do a huge amount of HIV testing, and they have a lot of people who come there regularly for testing. Studies that have been done in the whole city of Los Angeles with samples clearly identified that most of our recent cases are, in fact, found at that one research center. It is located in the heart of Hollywood. So it gets a lot of transient population and also gets a very gay identified population. Everybody there, all the negatives are, because of some funding from the health department, provided NAT testing, which is to identify acute HIV infection. So those are people who have not yet even seroconverted, so they test negative, but in fact have acute infection. Usually they're within 3 weeks of seroconversion. We get referred all the NAT positives. And then all the new diagnoses, we offered the use of the detuned assay, so they test positive and we see if they have recent infection. And then there's a lot of people who come in as regular retesters. And so they actually have documented a negative case on file at LAGLC, and then we're able to see that the following test was a positive. So we've gotten a number of that way. And then we have some physicians that have referred to us from some of the other sites. And interestingly, even though they're referred from other sites, most of those guys decide to come to be enrolled at LAGLC. And then we do this active partner recruitment, and we do offer some reimbursement for people who have a successfully enrolled partner. And it's a cyber cohort, so people are followed up on the web. They can do their follow-up questionnaires by their telephone. We have web-enabled for telephone follow-up questionnaires, or they can use the IVR, which is an interactive voice recording system, by telephone, or they can just do it on the web and on a computer. And it's pretty interesting because we thought that the more ways we offered people to be engaged, the better follow-up we would have. And I use this interactive voice recording in some of my other studies. I'm doing a clinical trial of rectal applicators, and we're following people. We need a lot of follow-up data. And the IVR works great. For this study, no one has used our IVR. They're all doing it by the web. So that's fine, because it actually is a better method in terms of the complexity of the data we can collect. But we thought that people would want the option of the telephone, and we're finding it's not really of a benefit. So we're learning some things. So here's the data I pulled on the first 29. As I said, we do have 35. So one sad thing is we only have 2 partners so far. So we're working on that. Part of that is our IRB. We had a big fight to our IRB, and one of the reasons our study started late, we're almost a year behind, is because I had to go 5 times to the IRB, and I lost, in that they require that in the invitation, they tell them, I should have explained, I'll show you in a bit. The people are allowed to offer partners, invite them into the study in a number of different ways. They can send an anonymous text by their cell phone. They can send an email using the InSpot system. Some of you may have seen where they get an email invitation. They can also just call them up and bring them in. So we have about 4 ways people can invite partners in the study. But the invitations the IRB required says that an HIV positive person has invited you into the study. So I fought with them with that because these are people with recent infection, all of them with new diagnoses. And so some of these partners are people that they may not have known they were positive with when they had sex with. So this is a heck of a way to have somebody learn that you're positive. So I really felt like this would be a barrier. And I think it is. So the IRB did tell us that after a year, if we found this was a barrier, we could come back to them. So I'm ready to do that. And hopefully I can remove this thing that says an HIV positive person has invited you to study, and instead would just say you've been invited to be in a study. And that should, we hope, help with that. One of the things, though, that's interesting is I think I showed you in the ADERP sample, our mean age was, I think, about 34. And we had quite a few older men involved in the study. What has been interesting here, our mean age is 32, but our median is 30. And if you look here, we have about 50% of our sample that's under 30. Now, I do a lot of studies in Los Angeles with MSM, and usually our mean age is up around 40. We have a really hard time recruiting and enrolling young men in any study. Unfortunately, I mean, for the epidemic and for the health of people out there, we are enrolling lots of younger men in the study of recently infected men. So that suggests that there's a lot of infection going on among younger men. It also suggests that we're actually engaging them in a place where they want to be engaged, which is LAGLC. But this is of concern that they're younger. But as a researcher, I'm happy to see we've managed to get some younger men, because I think we don't have enough data on them. We have a few older guys, but really not very many. We have a nice breakdown by race. This is another really interesting thing and that we're doing here that we haven't seen as much in our other studies, is that almost half of our samples so far are Latino. We have enrolled, I think, 4 Spanish-only speaking men. And that's because it took us a while to get all of our ACASV information up and going in Spanish fully, but now it is all fully enabled, and we have a staff person at LAGLC who's Spanish speaking and able to do enrollments, because it's not just a question of your materials, you have to have a person able to engage. I should say it takes about 2 hours to do each enrollment, because people are recently infected, they want to have a conversation, they want to talk about it. The study coordinator, both who works at LAGLC and my study coordinator, are HIV testing and counselors. And part of the reason this has worked so well is because my study manager, Leo Coleman, works as a volunteer tester and counselor at LAGLC 1 day a week as well. So he is involved with testing and diagnosing and counseling people all the time. And he does it as a volunteer, and he's embedded at the center. And so when he enrolls people in our study, he's able to provide quite a bit of counseling and support that they need. There's a lot of talking that goes on. We needed to provide that for people who are Spanish speaking as well. So we have that. We're really happy that we have that many. We know we have a big epidemic in Los Angeles among Spanish-only MSM. Very hard to, again, reach and recruit and enroll them. This was pretty interesting. Other piece I pulled out was that about 10% of our sample have been incarcerated in the last year. So who are our recently infected men that we have now? Most of them have sex with men only. We have none that had sex with just women, and only 6.7% that were bisexual. In terms of the past year number of male partners, this is our mean and median. It's about what it was in ADERP, a little bit less, but pretty big range. Past 3 months, number of sex partners, 4.8. Again, that's a little bit less than we were seeing in ADERP, but still pretty active. Past month, number of male sex partners, about 2. Always using a condom during anal intercourse, about 1/3. So remember, this is at baseline when they're enrolled. Again, so who were their partners? Very similar. We have about 1/3 of them with a main partner. And a pretty even split with the rest. So most people, 50%, have a main or a regular partner at baseline. And we'll see what happens over the year. The HIV status of the partner, again, this is baseline, remember? So we'll see if this will change, but about 78% report that their last partner was a negative partner. Very few percent reported that their last partner they knew was a positive person. The last sex, so IUI is insertive, unprotected anal intercourse, and it was about an equal percent. So we talked about serosorting, which is when people pick a sex partner of the same HIV status. Another risk reduction approach that we think may be going on in the community, but there's not clear data on, is something called sexual positioning, which is where people pick to have a sexual position. They choose one that is less risky for transmission. So if you are positive, you're less likely to give HIV to another person if you're receptive. Right? If you're the insertive partner, and we know that a lot of HIV is in the semen, right, you're more likely to transmit. So if you were choosing a position that would be less likely to give someone else HIV, you'd see more receptive intercourse going on. and we see equal numbers. So we don't see a lot of evidence at baseline for changes in choicing in sexual positioning. And we'll be following this over the year. Not yet, so they may change. Drug use at last sex. So I thought this was interesting. We got more heroin than we've seen. Los Angeles has not been a big heroin city. And it was interesting because I was talking about this with my good friend and colleague Steve Shoptaw, and he got all excited about this because he said, boy, you've got younger guys and you've got heroin use. Maybe this is a new trend. This is a lot. So we're going to be looking at this more carefully. And then like in the news 2 days ago, there was this big story that there's more heroin use going on in the Valley, and particularly among younger men. So we may be seeing an upsurge in heroin use. Not clear. I think it's a little early with just our 29 men and no comparison group to say anything's happening, but I was surprised that it was so much more common than our amphetamine use. And so when we looked at it, we do see an amphetamine use is higher than heroin. I don't think that's a surprise. But in the past 3 months, we see about an equal report. So that's use in general. That's not associated with sex. The other thing was associated with sex with the last partner. So that could be higher because the last partner was not necessarily in the past 3 months. Injection drug use, though, remains only at about 3.5%. So we have a very different epidemic, I think, than what you see here locally, where you have a lot more injection drug use and a lot more heroin use. Our viral load at enrollment. We have a big range of what's going on here. And I think this reflects how our recruitment happens, which I'll show you on the next slide. But a lot of our guys, by the time they enroll, you know, we contact them at the time, but we try to not be overly aggressive because we're trying to be sensitive to the fact that this is the time that they've received a diagnosis and we are a research study. So sometimes from the time that we first are in touch with somebody until they enroll, it can be a couple weeks. By that time, they may already have been in care. They may have been already getting treatment. The nice thing about doing our study at LAGLC is that they have a HIV treatment center on site right there. It's also good for other referrals. We've done a lot of referrals for social services help. We have a scale of measuring depression, and we have what's called a distress protocol, so that anyone who is identified as being extremely depressed or suicidal can be immediately referred, and as soon as they answer the questionnaire, they're flagged. So far, out of our 35, we've had one person, well, 37 including the partners, we've had one person who had some indication of distress. They weren't high distress, but enough that we made sure that they were in touch with a counselor immediately. We are getting a lot of STIs, though. So I only pulled the rectal, GC, and CT here because I was really amazed. We have, again, our numbers are small, but 20% of our guys have rectal chlamydia at baseline. And that's 28% had either a rectal chlamydia or gonorrhea at baseline. We also have syphilis. It's just, as everyone knows, syphilis data, it's a little messier to pull out. So we have a lot of people who are testing positive for RPR and syphilis. But because they're HIV positive, we really work with the county to get the correct disposition of whether or not they're a new case. So that takes a while. So here's how we get them. One really interesting thing is, so we have about 14% of the guys that are in so far that we've identified through our detuned assay, although this week we just got 2 new ones. I think one's being enrolled tomorrow and the other on Monday. We have 35%, about 10 of them have come as NATs. So those are real acutes. And then we have 50% that come from these previous test results. So we have a lot of people that are regulars, so to speak, at LAGLC. And remember, in order to enroll, we have to be able to see the test. So either there has to be a record of it on site or they have to bring it to us. And then we have some doctor referrals, and we do have one person who, no, I guess it's 2 at this point, who are pending, so that means they've agreed to be in the study. One of them was a detuned after because he didn't have his negative test. Another one, the doctor had the test. These are all waiting enrollment. So of the percent referred to us, we enroll 60%. Now we have about 20 coupons that are out there, but only 2 have enrolled. And in talking to my study manager, he's had quite a bit of communication with people that were referred as partners. A lot of them say they're coming in, but they never actually show up. So we have decided that our issue is that we're not engaging them in the study somehow. So either, it's not that we're not hitting them, they're being invited, but they're not being captured. So we need to work on that piece a little bit more and figuring out how to actually engage them and bring them in. So one of the things we're doing with that is this was our referral card, and my study staff said that it looked a little too cutesy. and they didn't think it was hip enough. So, oh, this is what the card looks like that you would get. I thought that was kind of hip, but apparently not. So we moved to some other imagery. And that was from a local photographer who provided some images to us that were selected by the study staff, which we hope will be a little more engaging. And so will be up on our website shortly. We also have some modeling, which is being done, which we're excited about. Steve Goodrow, who some of you may know, who's from University of Washington. Probably, Mark, you know him. Yeah, he is working with us on doing some modeling of this data as it comes forward. This is the model that he sent. He's interested in calculating the probability of HIV transmission per unprotected coital act, given the length of time in the partnership, the gender of the partners, the partnership type, and the viral load. So we're excited to be working with Steve, and he's going to be coming to UCLA to give a talk. And he's been working with us. He looked at the questionnaire and early on, and we made sure that we had all the measures he wanted. Here's some more of our new images. And our blood specimens, which are being saved and in our repository. And we have a new collaboration with Susan Eshelman from Johns Hopkins, where she's going to be using our specimens. We have 3 different samples saved to look at some of the new assays for identifying recent infection. One of the nice things about our sample is that although it's not that big, we have a diversity of when people were enrolled. So it's not all acutes. We have some acutes and some who were detuned and some with the test. So we have some people that are people across the spectrum of when they were infected. So it's a nice sample for her to work with for this thing. And as part of that, she's going to do some free phylogenetic analysis and other things for us. So we're really excited about that. And that's pretty much it. That's where we have been, and this is where we're going. So we're excited. We did see in the previous 5 years in this other sample that decreases in risk behavior were not sustained. In the next 5 years, as we follow this new cohort, we will see if the same pattern unfortunately persists or if we do a little better at sustaining risk behavior, sustaining decreases in risk behavior. We did see that more main partners were acquired over time, but that risk within the stable partnerships may increase even if they're serodiscordant. It's very hard for people with an intimate partner to to use condoms, to not practice UAI, regardless of the HIV status. We find that the depth and detail we corrected in terms of the behavioral data is really necessary if you want to study transmission dynamics. And I didn't really talk about, but we have some new methods that we're using in this study to look at the partnership level. One of the challenges and disappointments in the ADERP data set was that we asked people about their partners over time. We asked them to give us initials, but then when we went to do the analysis, we found that we couldn't actually match partners over time. Initials changed. People had a hard time. It was actually impossible to figure out somebody who said they were with the person, which actual partner that was. The partner matching was very difficult. So we have a new set of techniques that we're using where we pre-populate the data in each of our follow-up interviews from the previous interview on the partner characteristics so that we don't just ask for the initials, but that we also provide them some information. So you said this was Jim, but you also said you met him here and that he had this color hair and that he was of that ethnicity. And so we provide some of that information, and we've done this in another study where we're trying to see if that helps us better match up this partner over time, so we really know which is the ongoing partnership among multiple partners. So at the end of the year, they'll be able to match over 6 partners that between baseline and over the year to see who is continuing after the year. And that we have this nice multidisciplinary team. We have another colleague that's been added this year, Rafi Landowitz, who's from our care clinic and is an infectious disease doctor, is looking at, he got a K award, and he's added some questions on pre-exposure prophylaxis and also post-exposure prophylaxis. And we did find in this that we had about 4% of our sample who said they had done or knew someone who'd done, I think they had taken themselves some method of pre-exposure prophylaxis. So anyone who's involved in some of the work in the PrEP trials that are going on knows that there's a lot of PrEP studies and a lot of people being involved, and we want to see over time how much that impacts our group and whether or not people are involved in that. So also our community relationship has been very important and has grown stronger over time, and that's been really the essential part of doing this study.